2022 has started, and we are starting off the year with a phenomenal tasting. We have the man, the myth, the legend, literally the wine star legend, Dave Stare, here to talk to us about that first harvest of red wines that he did. And we'll let him tell you a little bit more about that. And of course, Kim Stare Wallace is here. So this is just the star-studded duo before us. Couple housekeeping things. I have everybody on mute. I'm going to ask you to stay on mute so that we don't get interrupted by, cats and dogs and vacuum cleaners and doorbells and all that good stuff. So I appreciate you kind of keeping yourself on mute so we can keep this all under control. We do have the chat button. I will be monitoring that. So please put your questions in the chat, your comments. Let us know what you think about the wines you're tasting, what you're having for dinner. Anything that we need to know. We'd love to know what the weather's like where you are. We want to make us really interactive. So have that on. We also have the live transcript button enabled. So if you want to see the weird Zoom, interpretation of what we're saying along the bottom, please go ahead and turn that on just by clicking the live transcript. And we should be good to go. So without further ado, I introduce Kim Stare Wallace and Dave Stare for our tasting tonight.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. How are you?
I got to switch my glasses and make sure I can see everybody. I see so many familiar faces, and thank you for joining us. And I feel like Dad and I are going to go on the road together soon, because last night we actually did a radio show together here in Santa Rosa. And we've been spending a lot of time together, haven't we, Dad?
Yes.
So I am zooming in from my office, which used to be my father's office. Isn't that funny? And Dad is zooming in from the cellar, which is where I used to play with my Barbie dolls when I was a little girl. And he was the winemaker and starting the winery. So definitely a trip down memory lane. And as we commence our 50th anniversary year, it seems like the perfect thing to do to kind of take a step back and taste together the wines that inspired Dad's first red wines here at the winery and the wines that we continue to produce today. And so I'm going to sort of pretend that I'm I guess an interviewer, and I'm going to be asking my father questions, and I'll try not to lead the witness too much, Dad. Promise.
I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Okay. So first of all, just because I think there might be some people on this call that maybe are newer to the brand or newer to the winery, but I'd like you to share with everybody, how did you get started? And, did you grow up in a winemaking family? Like, what's your background?
No, I was raised in the suburban Boston area and went to MIT undergraduate school in Northwestern for an MBA. And my first love in life was always railroads. And so I had a summer job with the Pennsylvania Railroad for a couple of years. And I worked for about 3.5 years for the Baltimore Ohio Railroad living in Baltimore. But one of the things I always wanted to do was live overseas. And before I had too many kids, I started studying German at Johns Hopkins University Night School. And after a couple of years, I was able to get a job in Germany working for a German steel firm doing marketing research work. We lived right on the Rhine River, just north of the town of Koblenz, and many weekends were spent driving up and down the Rhine and the Moselle, tasting wine and getting to love German wines. And when we came back from Germany in spring of '69, when I think Kim was 8 years old, 7? No, you were
69. I would have been. Oh, I don't even want to say. Then they'll know how old I am.
Anyways, and that summer, the summer of '69, I took a course in wine appreciation at the Boston Center for Adult Education. And the man who taught the course became a good friend of mine. And he had just started a small importer in Massachusetts. And I asked my friend Fred Eck for a job. He said, no, we're not hiring anybody. So then I decided, well, I'll do something else in the wine business. So in June of 1970, I spent 2 weeks in France, in Burgundy and Bordeaux, and came up with a scatterbrained idea that what I really wanted to do for the rest of my life was somehow move back to France and get into the wine business. Well, fortunately for me and for France, just after coming back from that trip, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about what a great future California had for becoming a world-class wine growing area. And as a result of that article, I forgot about France and turned my eyes to California. Actually made my first trip out here in November of 1970 and went to UC Davis and Fresno State, talked to the Wine Institute, met as many vintners as I could, and went back home and told my wife and kids we were moving to California. We moved out here the summer of 71. I spent my first year out here as a special graduate student at Davis studying enology and viticulture. Most of my free time on the weekends was not spent studying, but a lot of it was spent over here in Sonoma, Napa, and Mendocino, and the other, let's say, more traditional wine growing areas of California, looking at property, talking to people. And in March of 72, early on in the search, it became apparent to me that the place to do what I wanted to do was somehow in somewhere in northern Sonoma County. Northern Sonoma County has had a reputation of grape growing going back well over 100 years, and land was fairly readily available at reasonable prices. A lot of second and third generation farming families were kind of breaking up and selling their farms. And so I was able to fortunately put together a project and ended up buying a roughly 70-acre rundown prune orchard in the Dry Creek Valley of Sonoma County, and started the winery. And here we are today.
Here we are today. So Dad, I remember, because he used to, load my baby sister and me in the car on the weekends and look around, drive around looking at property. And I remember it vividly because, youngsters don't like generally car trips, right? But I'm curious, like, how did you, or what was it about the Dry Creek Valley that attracted you to this area as opposed to, for example, Napa Valley? Because I remember one time we were driving together down Highway 29 and my father pointed out a parcel that he said, you know what, Mom and I almost bought that and we almost started the winery over here.
Well, northern Sonoma County, Dry Creek, Alexander Valley, and Russian River Valley, which are the three valleys that radiate out of the town of Healdsburg, land was about half the price as it was in Napa, and it had the reputation going back well over 100 years, and it seemed like the place to be.
Do you remember what land cost back then?
Anywhere between $2,000 and $3,000 an acre.
Oh boy.
That was unplanted land, and planted vineyard was somewhere in the $4,000 to $6,000 acre range. And over in Napa, it was probably double those prices.
Right. Oh, fascinating. So what were your first red wines, and how did you decide to produce those first red wines?
Well, in 72, our original plan was to produce Chenin Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, and Chardonnay, and Cabernet. But beginning October, roughly the 1st of October of 72, there were 2 weeks of solid rain here in northern Sonoma County, in fact, all over California. And red grapes, which tend to be harvested after white grapes, were left on the vines during the rains, and after the vines, they just weren't worth picking. And I don't think there was a decent California red wine made in 72. So, oh, there's a picture of me. Anyways, so in 73, we started making reds here at the winery. And I think the first wine we ever made we made what was known as a Premier Zinfandel, which was a kind of a Beaujolais style Zinfandel made from the grapes grown on the Norton Ranch over off of Lytton Springs Road. And it was a style that was not barrel aged. It was, look at the label, it was briefly aged in new French and American oak barrels. But basically, it was a wine that was bottled in the spring and summer following harvest, and it was kind of a Beaujolais style, a young fruity wine. And that's the only year we ever made the Premier Zinfandel. We also made our second Zinfandel that year, which I think we called Heavy Zinfandel. And that was more traditionally a longer barrel aging and longer fermentation time. I think the Premier Zinfandel was aged or was fermented just for 4 or 5 days. I don't exactly recall, and I'm not. Maybe it says in the labels you're seeing, but it was a Zinfandel made for cash flow. I had to make wines in this year, the first couple of years, that we could sell within a year or so because I didn't have tons and tons of money backing me up. So
no oil well?
What?
No oil well?
No.
No
Also,
oil well.
in 73, we also made some Cabernet. I think the vineyard it was Rex Holmes, his vineyard, who was a neighbor of ours, and Rex's wife also was an artist and designed our first label. They were good friends and neighbors where we lived here in West Dry Creek Road.
Yeah, I love that last photograph of the Zinfandel that was called Heavy Style of Zinfandel, but the alcohol was 13.1%. I don't know if anybody picked up on that.
I didn't know.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe folks, maybe we should just taste a little Zinfandel. That seems like a good segue. Hopefully you all have our yummy Heritage Vines Zinfandel in front of you. I know you do too, Dad, right?
Yep.
So obviously, fast forward all these years later, Zinfandel is very much a part of our legacy. We've been producing it every single year since, and as you all know, we make numerous different bottlings, but this Heritage Vines Zinfandel is very special to me because it grows right in front of my house. And this is the vineyard that my husband Don planted, and our first crop was in 1994. And at the time, it was a pretty innovative process in the fact that, or in the sense that all Zinfandel here in Dry Creek Valley that had predated Prohibition, the old pre-Prohibition vines, had begun to decline. They were either being torn out or dying out over the years. And we became quite concerned about the future of Zinfandel. And this is in the early 1990s. And so we began a propagation technique where we collected essentially virus-free budwood from a very famous old ranch, an old vineyard called the Mazzoni Ranch in Geyserville, and used that to graft onto rootstock planted in a new vineyard. And it coincided with when Dawn and I were fortunate enough to purchase the parcel of land directly adjacent to or due south of Dry Creek Vineyard. And it was just a stroke of luck that parcel that was actually a vineyard came up for sale. It was planted to the old Davis clone, and it used to be sold to Gallo, but the quality of the fruit was not very good. So we quickly tore that out and then planted to our Heritage Vines Zinfandel. And of course, our first vintage was 1997. And we called it back then Heritage Clone Zinfandel. And I figured out after, I don't know, how many years was it, Dad? Maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years that the word clone didn't have a very romantic sound, especially during the time when the British were having there was all that controversy about sheep cloning, if any of you remember that. So we renamed it just Heritage Vines Zinfandel. But this is unequivocally, I would say, our flagship Zinfandel. Of course, it always includes a nice blend of Petite Syrah. I believe it has 21%, this particular vintage. And 2019, as far as a vintage goes, Dad and I tasted this together last night on this radio show, and everybody was just blown away at the richness and complexity, and also the balance and elegance. And as I recall, 2019 was a pretty mild growing season, and we had quite a long harvest. I think we actually harvested for something like 70 days. So really nice long growing season, even ripening, beautifully balanced. I don't know, I personally am very fond of this wine. I know most of you are too. And
it's my wife's and my favorite wine at home.
Oh, good. That makes me proud that we make a wine that is your favorite at home. Yeah, and of course, this is the one that got us our first top 100 in the Wine Spectator year before last, I think it was. And it's a great example of how Zinfandel doesn't have to be over the top, highly, high overripe, highly, sort of overblown, if you will. And there are still, it's declining, I think, but there are still Zinfandels out in the market where some people prefer that style. That's, almost like a port-like style of wine where the fruit is picked at very high sugars, and, the alcohol is in excess of 15%. And of course, that is not our shtick here at Dry Creek Vineyard. So
I think one of the things that makes a great wine is balance. And I think when you have high alcohol wines, they're just not balanced. They just, they're overblown and all, and if you know what I mean.
Well, and you know what's interesting, Dad, and everybody, we've been tasting quite a few of our library wines in the last, for the last 12 months in preparation for this year, where we're going to be releasing some very rare library wines, and we're putting together some kind of curated collections. And it's fascinating because some of the wines that are in our cellar that have aged the best are wines with a little bit less alcohol and definitely with brighter acidity. And some of those very flashy, ripe, kind of opulent vintages don't seem to age as well. It's very interesting.
Yeah, as the sugar increases, the acidity drops. And in order for a wine to age well, it's got to have a decent level of acidity.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should move on. So actually, before we moved into the Bordeaux Browse, I wanted to ask you, how did you know what to do at that first harvest? Like, you're fresh out of college. You didn't work at any other wineries. It's not like you were an intern anywhere.
I didn't know what to do. Literally, I was there with the textbook from Davis, kind of reading the formula. But I have to admit, I had some help. In 72, our first year, we actually made our wines over at Cuvison. That's the year we made no red wine. We also fermented there. Other wineries working at Cuvison then were Bernard Porte from Clos de Val and Chuck Ortman from Spring Mountain. So there were actually 4 wineries at one crush facility, including Cuvison. But Chuck and Bernard were very helpful and give me pointers. And then in 73, when we started making wines here, I think that year Tom Dalier helped out. We went on to found Dalier Winery, a very good Sonoma County winery. And I think in 74, Fred Brander, who was a friend of mine from Davis, Fred has a winery down in Santa Barbara County, Brander Vineyards, makes very good Sauvignon Blanc. But they kind of helped out and kind of served as our advisors during the harvest. I think sometime in 73 or 4, John Jaffrey came to work for us. John was essentially our first winemaker, and John was with us for about 6 years and went on to other things. But
I love, it's fascinating, Dad. I have to say you were very brave because you were you were probably about 30 years old at the time.
I was 31, I think.
31 years old. I mean, you really were. You were everybody knows you were a pioneer, but I also just think you were very brave. That took a lot of courage to do that.
Crazy too.
You were a little crazy, it's true. And of course, very pig-headed. We know that. So what about Merlot? Tell us about, because the next wine we'd like you all to taste is the Merlot, the 2018 Merlot. And I think before we actually taste it, I'd like to know, about how you learned about Merlot and kind of where did you get your inspiration for Merlot back in the early days? You mentioned a little bit of having traveled to Bordeaux.
Well, Merlot is the principal grape of the right bank of the Gironde River in Bordeaux in Saint Emilion, and it's a Bordeaux grape that tends to be a little bit softer, I think, and I just wanted to play around with it, and we bought, I think it came from Jack Long's vineyard, Jasper Long, I don't know what else to say.
Well, you know what? So this is such a fascinating tidbit of information, you guys. So right before we jumped on this, I was asking Tim, our winemaker, a little bit about the current vintage of Merlot, and he reminded me that the fruit is predominantly from Jasper Long's vineyard. Now, Jasper Long has passed on, but Jack Long is the proprietor, and it's the same family that we've been working with. So this, we've had this enduring relationship with the same grower here in Dry Creek Valley for almost 50 years. I mean, it's incredible. I think that's incredible.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Was Merlot popular here in the States back at the time? Do you remember?
I don't really think so. I think the main red varieties at that time were Zinfandel and Cabernet Sauvignon. There were people experimenting. Oh my gosh, there I am inside a tank of wine. I'm not sure whether that's Cabernet or Merlot.
What do you have any idea what year that photograph was?
Probably 73 or 4.
Okay, we were trying to figure that out earlier.
Yeah.
I love the mustache and the glasses.
Yes.
So didn't you also make in 1974 did you make a little Gamay Beaujolais?
We made Gamay Beaujolais for 1 or 2 years. Again, it was kind of a cash flow wine. We needed wines that we could sell the following year. And Gamay Beaujolais is a variety that doesn't need to be aged a long time. I'm not sure how much we made of it, but we made probably a few hundred cases. And it was to help cash flow out.
Yeah. Well, and of course, interesting, our Merlot has had really a fascinating history over the years. We've made reserve Merlots. We've made kind of signature style Merlots. We've tried to eliminate making Merlot because most of the Merlot that we produce, of course, is used in our Cabernet and our other Bordeaux blends. So we've tried to kind of eliminate Merlot in a way as a separate bottling, but it just is like the little engine that could. And it has defied, the odds of certainly the movie Sideways, years ago. I'm sure some of you guys remember that that movie. But it has just kind of stood the test of time. And I don't know, the 2018, which I'm just going to taste right now, and I encourage all of you to as well. I think this is just so balanced and elegant, and it really kind of has, it's sort of, there's a beautiful silkiness. I think that, Tim has really dialed in the right amount of oak. There's not too many new barrels, and there's a right amount of new barrels versus older barrels. As we spoke about, the majority of the fruit for this wine is actually from the Long Vineyard, which is just down the road, same family that we made that first 1974 vintage from. And of course, this is a wine that, similar to all of our Bordeaux varietals, it's not 100% Merlot. It is in fact 78% Merlot with a smattering of Cabernet Sauvignon, and then actually 9% Malbec, 7% Cabernet Franc, and I think 4% Petit Verdot.
That's probably a fairly common blend that you'd see from wines from Saint Emilion in Bordeaux.
Sarah, can you flip back to the 74 Merlot label and see what the blend, was it a blend or was it 100% Merlot? Let's see. Oh, this looks like 100% Merlot. And again, I'll point out the alcohol, 12.8%. And boy, I wish we had some bottles of this to taste, don't you? That would be fun. Now, the last 74 that I had was actually our Cabernet. We had a magnum of it that I brought to the Wine Spectator's big bottle party I'd say it was about 10 years ago. And I remember Jim Lobby, who used to be the wine critic for Wine Spectator, tasted it, and I didn't tell him what it was. And we just did it as a blind tasting. And mind you, there were probably 150 vintners there at this big party. And he was mighty impressed with that 74 Cabernet. And it made me very proud of what you made, Dad, because that was your first vintage.
I frankly still think the 74 Cabernet was probably the best wine we've ever made.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, shame on us for not holding more back, huh?
We still have some, don't we?
I don't think so.
A couple of cases.
But we do have a question in the chat.
Sure.
So I want to jump into that. Is how many winemakers have we had through the years?
We have had a total of 5, I believe, including Dad. Yep, we had, so Dave Stare, John Jaffrey, Larry Levine, Jeff McBride, Bill Nuttall, and then Tim Bell. So
6.
Yeah, 6 including you. And Tim, of course, has been with us since, he's coming up on his 11th harvest, I think.
Yeah,
is it 11?
2011 when he started. So.
Yeah. And he also is a UC Davis graduate.
We have another UC Davis graduate in here. Looks like Carl. He arrived at grad school at UC Davis in the fall of '71.
No way.
Which one is Carl?
He's got a red shirt on. He was just giving
hi,
us
Carl, raise your So I wonder if how funny.
What degree were you?
Here, I'm asking him to unmute. See.
So I was the wrong side of fluid science. I was in chemical engineering instead of enology.
Okay. I love it. Well, Dad, did you get a degree from UC Davis?
No, I didn't. It's funny. I have an MBA from Northwestern and a civil engineering degree from MIT. And when I went out to Davis to talk about being admitted as a graduate student, I was advised that you're a little bit short on your chemistry. You should probably take a summer course in organic chemistry. So that's the summer of '71. Before I moved to California, I was a student at Boston University, taking organic chemistry every day from 8:30 to 12, and every afternoon labs from 1 to 4. And I'll tell you, BU was not air conditioned at that time. And Boston in the summer, as you know, if you've ever been there, can be pretty hot and muggy. And it was the worst class I've ever had in my life. But I passed it. And then when I got the Davis, Professor Singleton said, well, you probably should have taken it. That might not have been the best course to take, but so well, I took it.
I see a question that just popped up that maybe I'll answer, since I hired the last winemaker, which is Tim. Somebody wanted to know, how do you hire a winemaker and how do you place all that trust in them? And boy, isn't that the truth? You have to have a lot of trust. But I remember when we were hiring for Tim's position in 2011, of course, we had umpteen interviews and all of that. But one of the most important things we did is we tasted all of the wines that he had previously made at his place, his former winery where he worked. And then we, and when I say we, it was Dawn and myself, we had him taste all of our wines. And so we spent, I'd say, like 6 hours just tasting wines together. And, especially since we already had a very defined kind of philosophy and house style here at the winery. And it was really important to find a winemaker that would respect that and also not only add to that, but really respect it. And what was beautiful about Tim is he's a classicist like we are. He really loved the classic sort of traditional, elegant, in this case, Bordelaise approach. He loved our, Sauvignon Blancs and the bright acidity and all of that, and the Zinfandels. The one wine he had not made was Chenin Blanc. And he admitted to me later that he was terrified that first vintage of Chenin Blanc, which was 2011, but he knocked it out of the park as he has ever since. And but it takes a tremendous amount of trust. Absolutely.
So we do have one more question that it got sent directly to me instead of the whole chat. You've talked about the lower alcohol of these wines, which I think is fascinating. And so Vince and Linda were wondering, why do newer vintages have a higher alcohol content than the wines of the 70s?
I think probably the yeast strains are a little bit more efficient in converting sugar to alcohol than the strains we used 50 years ago. But that's just my guess.
I also think there's been a trend towards higher alcohol wines for whatever reason. I don't know. Certainly beginning in, I'd say, the 90s and in the 2000s, things were getting really ripe. And I think other parts of California, more warmer climate regions, i.e. Lodi and, other areas of the state that are warmer, started to come on the scene and introducing wines that are higher in alcohol. I don't know. It's fascinating, isn't it? I suppose it would be interesting to know. Well, we actually did an analysis not too long ago about our picking decisions, or picking dates over the last, say 30 years. Has it gotten warmer here? In other words, is fruit getting riper earlier? Due to climate change or whatever. And our vineyard manager, Matt Bogenson, basically did a study for me, and it appears that we're still picking at about the same time, which is usually, mid to end of August. So I don't know as it's that. I don't know. Sarah, do you have any ideas?
I think it's a combination of different things. I think too that the culture has changed, and so people are used to drinking more high alcohol wines, and so you notice there's a really big difference between wines that are lower in alcohol versus higher in alcohol. And I think a lot of times the higher in alcohol wines sell. I think we kind of go against the grain because our wines are still very, moderate in alcohol and kind of considered on the lower end.
I think the current Mariner is 13.5%.
Yeah, if you look at Zinfandel, especially, a lot of them are 16%, and ours are still in that 13.5 to 14.5. So, we kind of typically make our wines that way.
I would somewhat disagree with what Matt told you, because I recall back in the 70s, we very seldom did any harvesting prior to Labor Day.
Really?
The last dozen years, so I think we typically started the latter part of August.
Well, Matt's records only go back for 30 years. So, and of course, Matt Vogenson, he was just a little, he may not have even been born. Actually, he wouldn't have been born when we started the winery, because Matt's probably 45 years old at this point. Yeah. But his father was a grower of ours for years. So I don't know. Anyway, well, okay, let's move on to Cabernet. So what was your approach to making your first Cabernet?
Well, I never wanted to make a 100% Cabernet, because all the great Bordeaux's are always blends. And from the Medoc region, they're predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon with lesser amounts of the other Bordeaux varieties. So we've never really made a 100% Cabernet Sauvignon.
And let's see. Okay, so 1973. So what's really funny, Dad, is I don't know if you remember, but your 73 Cabernet actually had 30% Zinfandel in it. So what happened there?
Well, the Cabernet that we bought that year was a little bit lower sugar than we wanted, and to beef the wine up, it just made sense to blend it with some higher sugar Zinfandel, so that both wines were fermented separately, and then in the blending process we decided to add 30% of Zinfandel to the Cabernet to beef it up and make it a little bit richer style of wine.
And you were still allowed to call it though Cabernet, because today you wouldn't be allowed to call it Cabernet.
The rule up until the mid 80s, if it had to be 51% Cabernet Sauvignon to call it Cabernet. Now that rule was changed sometime in the mid 80s or maybe late 70s to 75% Cabernet. And that's when Meritage became a popular style of wine.
Absolutely. Interesting. Well, were there specific Bordeaux producers that inspired you? Because you mentioned you went to Bordeaux in the summer of, I think you said 71.
I really can't recall any specific ones.
Okay.
One year we did have the son of one of the winemakers that worked here as a stage for a harvest. I forget who he was, or what winery his dad ran, but it's one of the better known wineries in Bordeaux. I forget the name though.
Well, let's give a little taste on this one. Yum. Well, and so one of the interesting things about our Cabernet evolution here is that over the years, so originally the first vintage was, well, it's interesting, Dad. It says it's a Sonoma County appellation, so perhaps it was. But over the years, one of the things that Dawn and I began to recognize when we wanted to kind of shape the winery for the future is we really wanted to go back to the Dry Creek Valley as the origin for our Bordeaux varietals. And so ever since 2003, our Cabernets have been 100% Dry Creek Valley. We've retained the legacy art of blending, if you will, that Dad started here, the concept of Bordeaux blending. And in this particular vintage is 79% Cabernet and 12% Merlot, 5% Malbec, 2% Cabernet Franc, and 2% Petit Verdot. And I know many of you have been to some of the vineyards that comprise this blend. I see lots of familiar faces. And so I know you've been to, for example, the Endeavor Vineyard and whatnot. The 2018 vintage, which is this that we're tasting, unlike the 2018 was actually a little bit of a cooler vintage. When we first released the 2018s, they were a little closed in and tight, but I think they're just beautiful. And I think that this vintage is going to be one of those vintages that ages very well. There's a little, nice bright acidity. The alcohol is moderate. It's 13.5%. So we had a nice, I think this is one of those vintages. This is not based on any scientific fact, but just my gut instinct, having tasted all these vintages that we've had, that this is going to age well. So for example, 2008, if any of you have any of your 2008s, they should be tasting beautifully. 1998, another kind of slightly cooler vintage. What was another cooler vintage, Dad? Do you remember, or Sarah?
No, I have to admit I don't.
I remember the hot ones because the winemakers are always exhausted.
Yeah, they're exhausted
very fast
and stressed. So when you first made the Cabernet, how did you go out and sell it? Not even Cabernet, frankly, any of these wines. How did you actually sell them?
Well,
what did you do?
I basically would put samples in the back of my car and drive down to good wine shops. It's interesting. Mike Richmond, who used to be the winemaker at Freemark Abbey, was a good friend. And I remember asking Mike one day for who are the good wine shops in California. He gave me a list of Freemark Abbey's 100 favorite wine shops in California. And I kind of used those as my initial guide to where to go try to sell wine. And one kind of funny story I'll tell you is one of our first trips to Los Angeles, there used to be some stores in the south of Los Angeles and down by Redondo Beach called King Cellars. And I remember tasting the owner at King Cellars on a couple of the wines, and later on that evening I was having dinner at a restaurant about 9 o'clock, and this guy came walking into the same restaurant, and he didn't know I was going to be there, and he said, "Dave, we tasted those wines, they're pretty damn good, we'll take 5 cases of each of them."
Isn't that a thrilling? It's thrilling when that happens.
Yeah, and I remember our first several deliveries, we would actually rent a U-Haul truck. I'd call these stores up and say, what do you want to order? I'm coming down next week. They say, oh, 5 cases of this, 5 cases of that. We'd load a U-Haul truck would take about 200 cases of wine. And we would actually drive to LA and deliver the wines in person. This is before we had a broker down there. And at that time I had a friend who's, I used to stay at his house, and his hobby was repairing cuckoo clocks. And I remember spending one night in his house on the couch in the living room, and at midnight, 25 cuckoo clocks start cuckooing. And they started about 10 minutes before 12 and about 10 minutes after. And they built a crescendo about midnight. But 1 o'clock, when 1 o'clock rolled around, it was a lot quieter.
I love it. So I love that picture of you a few minutes ago of you in the tasting room.
Yes.
That's great. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to the winery back in those days when Dad actually was the tasting room manager, along with the winemaker and chief cook and bottle washer. And I used to work in the tasting room actually way before I was 21, highly illegal. But I worked in that tasting room for many years as well. So
that's now where our receptionist sits.
Exactly. So okay, you started the winery in 72. Your first red wines were 73. You started to get out there and, promote and sell and try to find customers. When would you say the winery actually became a viable business?
It took about 5 years. We actually, in 1977, I remember in mid-July getting a call from our CPA, Dave. It appears you guys made $22 in the first 6 months of this year, compared to a loss of, every previous year. And so one of our partners was up visiting her grandparents in Seattle, and I happened to be in Seattle about a month later. And I said, yeah, let me take you out for dinner and celebrate. We made $22 last 6 months. And I think I spent $100 on dinner. So we blew all the profits in one dinner.
Woohoo, 22. Oh my gosh. Well, Dad, so let's see. What would you say?
We have a couple of questions in the chat if you want to jump into that real quick.
Yes, thank you.
So Carl, your fellow UC Davis grad, he was asking back, was the Gamay that you made back in the day actually Gamay, or was it a California Gamay?
I don't recall.
And then we got a question, of course, about when did the nautical theme begin?
Oh, there was a picture of me in a sailboat named Zinfandel.
Yeah.
Sailing has always been my hobby, and about I'd say the early 80s, it became apparent that our label was somewhat dated, and we began to look around at what to do, and I think it was while we were out sailing on, I used to have a 36-foot sailboat on San Francisco Bay. One day, Kim and Don and myself and some friends were out in the boat. We started talking about coming up with a sailing label. And so we did. And the picture of the Zinfandel boat, Sonoma State University has a intercollegiate sailing team. And in the mid 80s, the school decided no longer to fund the team, and they needed to buy a new boat. So I volunteered. We ended up giving them buying two boats for UC Davis sailing team. It's interesting. One of the kids on the first time that the first year that they had the boats, I forget his name, but he was the guy from the Virgin Islands. What's his name, Kim?
Oh my gosh.
Anyways, he went on
on the tip of my tongue.
He went on to be the skipper of the Virgin Islands, entry into the America's Cup a few years later, and they didn't make it to the finals, but he became the tactician of one of the boats that actually won the America's Cup one time.
I wonder if Sonoma State still has a sailing team.
It's a good question.
Well, so what would you say? Obviously we've endured for 5 decades. I think we're proud of our success and where we've come. But what would you say has been your biggest regret?
Probably not being more aggressive buying property 40 years ago when it was reasonable.
Yeah. What has been your biggest source of pride?
You.
Woohoo! We practiced that. No, just kidding. No,
it's very nice to have family wanting to continue the business and to have someone as capable as Kim.
Aw, that makes me. Aw.
There she is.
Oh my gosh. And I came into this business literally kicking and screaming. I did not want to work here. As Dad knows, and I've shared with some of you, my girlfriends and I used to work here as teenagers on the bottling line because it was basically the only place that would hire us. And, it was not glamorous work. It was very hard work. And I didn't want to come to work for the winery. And I came back in my early 20s, and it's really been a joy ever since. I mean, I look at these pictures and it's amazing to me that all this time has gone by and
Kim went to San Francisco State and majored in fashion design.
I did. And that's right when I came back, the first thing I did is inform my father that his labels had to change. Anyway, well, one thing we kind of overlooked, which I think is very important for people to hear, is how you got the Dry Creek Valley to become a recognized AVA, because you put the term Dry Creek Valley on a label. I believe it was 83. So 11 years. No, you started off in the early 70s, but it wasn't until 83 that the region became a legal AVA.
We put the term Dry Creek Valley Dry Creek Valley on the label, and which was illegal. We forgot to put Sonoma County, and the BATF has to approve labels, and they rejected the label, and I appealed it, and I said, we've already had the labels printed, and they said, well, this time you can use those labels, but next year you got to put Dry Creek Valley of Sonoma County. And that's when I think I got together with Lou Preston and Lou Fapiano and a couple other vendors, and we started talking about actually trying to define the various appellations of Sonoma County, Alexander Valley, Dry Creek Valley, Rush River Valley, et cetera. And that's.
Do you remember how many AVAs were recognized back then?
Initially, there were 4. There was Valley of the Moon or Sonoma Valley, Alexander Valley, Dry Creek, and Rush River. And now there's Green Valley.
Well, now there's 19.
There are 19?
19 in Sonoma County. Yeah.
Wow.
I know. It's fascinating. Well, so let's just transition since your retirement. What are some of your hobbies and interests, and what are you enjoying doing with your free time?
Well, one of the things I've gotten back into, as you know, is music. I played banjo and trombone in high school. And when I went to college, both my trombone and banjo sat unused for about 55 years. And about 10 years ago, I was at a Christmas party in Healdsburg, and Lou Sobrana, who used to be the Healdsburg High School band director, who taught Kim and her sister how to play flute and clarinet, was at this party. And I said, Lou, what are you doing? He said, I run the New Horizons Band of Sonoma County. What's that? Oh, that's old guys and gals playing music. Do you have any instruments? I said, I have an old banjo and trombone, but I haven't played them in 50 years. He said, that doesn't matter. We can't use a banjo, but we can always use another trombone player. So I started playing trombone in the New Horizons Band about 10 years ago. And then a couple of years later, they started a Dixieland combo, and they needed a banjo player. So I got my banjo out and started playing that. And now I play in fact, we just had our last rehearsal today for the New Horizons. We have a concert this coming Saturday at Oakmont. About a 75-piece concert band, and we're beginning the concert with the Ukrainian national anthem.
Oh, I love that.
And the other band I play now is the Russian River Ramblers, which is an 8-piece New Orleans style Dixieland band. I play banjo on that.
I love that. I love that.
Music has become a major part of my life. And before I came here to the winery, I was at home practicing my banjo.
Well, and for anybody on this call who is coming to our 50th anniversary gala in June, I see you. The Russian River Ramblers are going to be playing during our cocktail hour, and we're having a New Orleans inspired evening, inspired by Dad and his band, because he loves Dixieland jazz so much.
We're thinking about changing the name of the band to the Ukrainian River Band.
Oh gosh. We can't change the theme of our party.
No, we're not.
I saw a question pop up. Let's see, what is it there? What are your goals moving forward?
To live another 20 years.
Oh, that's a good one. Any parting words for our guests, or any other questions for us?
Well, Kim, then what are your goals for the winery now that Dave's handed over to you? What's your goals for the winery for the next 50 years?
Oh my gosh. Well, I want to live for more than 20 years for sure. My goals, well, first of all, my goals are to continually learn and grow and improve and really bring our wines to an ever higher level of quality. You know, each vintage gives us that opportunity, and it's so exciting to, you know, our work is never done here. So just because these wines taste great this year doesn't mean we can't even continue to improve. And I think that that's something that's always in my, you know, kind of horizon or vision. And I know that Tim feels the same way. So it's to constantly improve the quality. It is definitely to build a legacy for hopefully my children to someday be a part of. They're still pursuing their own interests, and you know, they're having a lot of fun as 20-year-olds and learning. They're basically, there's a word for it. They're adulting. That's the new word, adulting. Who knew? But you know, my fondest hope is that, you know, and I don't know, at some point when maybe they're in their 30s and I'm not an old, you know, decrepit old lady, that they will say, hey, what's this winery all about? You know, I'll tell you one thing. Dawn is loading up the truck to drive to Montana. And many of you know that our kids are in Montana, and Dawn loves to spend time there. And both kids, I don't know if I told you this, Dad, both kids have put in a request for some wine. This is a very good sign.
That's
okay?
a positive sign. Yeah.
So when your 24-year-old is not asking, you know, or is not, you know, asking for beer money, this is a good sign.
I remember when I visited Spencer for the first time when he was at Montana State. I had to go to the bathroom, and I noticed the wastebasket in the bathroom was filled with empty beer cans. And you would specifically ask me to check in the beer consumption in the house.
Exactly. Anybody who has a college student knows this is true. Well, I don't know.
Someone spied the large format behind you and was wondering what it is. I don't know if you want to bring it to the camera.
So this is let's see if I can hold up. This is a 1998 Reserve Zinfandel. And, you know, this is a 3-liter. We every year we make, it really depends on the vintage, but sometimes we make just a handful of 3 liters. Sometimes we make, you know, 10, 20, 30 3-liters. Sometimes we make 6 liters. And we've actually got quite a collection of, you know, older big bottles. And of course, we're also releasing very soon. I think actually in your next club shipment, you'll be getting the very exciting, drum roll here, 50th anniversary Cabernet Sauvignon. That's a really special wine produced in honor of our anniversary. It is absolutely delicious. You will love it, love it, love it. And we did make a very small amount also in magnums. I can't remember how many bottles, but that is going to be in your next club shipment. So you'll have to watch for that. But yep, good eye, whoever spotted that.
Well, then we have a few other exciting things that I'll give you a little heads up on before we wind up our afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. So a couple other things to watch out for is that we will be actually releasing some library wines. So we're going to release them periodically through the year. The first set will be in a few weeks, so kind of the 3rd week of April, and it'll be a pair of 1983 Cabernets. So if library wines is something that you are interested in, watch out for that email. There are not many available. It is something that will only happen this one time, and then it will be gone. So
can I interrupt you, Sarah?
Yeah.
Pardon me. I just want to tell the folks here, okay, so 1983 is a perfect example of one of those vintages that was challenging. It is not recognized as a great vintage. And our 83s are stellar. There is something about, you know, those wines that have aged beautifully. I mean, we did a tasting of some of these library wines for some very snooty wine writers a number of years ago. And we picked wines from sort of I don't want to call them off vintages, but they're not the, you know, not the famous vintages like 97 or 2005, et cetera. And we blew these wine writers' minds away because the 83s, the 89s, you know, as I said, the 98s, et cetera, just aged so well. And I think it has to do with that acidity level.
Absolutely. Well, and so then the Prestons just hit on something that we will also be releasing, our sparkling Shen Blanc. So the Prestons were asking, why did we choose Shannon and not a grape grown in Dry Creek? And I'll give you a little sneak peek of that label too, while Kim answers that question.
Well, so this was a subject that we were really excited about making a sparkling wine, obviously, to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And we wanted to do something that, that really was kind of celebrated who we are, right? And one of, obviously, we're a Sauvignon Blanc producer. We make a small amount of Chardonnay, but Chenin, there's no sparkling Sauvignon Blancs, but there are beautifully made Cremants in the Loire Valley from Chenin Blanc. And so the concept of making a sparkling Chenin Blanc was very exciting to us. We spent several years learning about it, tasting wines from the Loire. We ended up settling on a blend that includes a little bit of Cabernet Franc and with the Chenin, which is a very classic, Loire blend. And I mean, Tim and Brian, our associate winemaker, had a great deal of fun, making this. We all did, making this wine. So I guess to make a long story short, it was really to celebrate Chenin and our 5 decades of Chenin in a new, fun way. And we could have done a Chardonnay Pinot Noir blend. We could have done a more traditional method champenoise style, but this seemed like a really great twist. And it's, we like to do things a little differently here.
Summer of '75, we spent about a month in the Loire Valley in the town of Rochefort-sur-Loire, staying at a fellow's house, Jean Baumard, who has one of the most well-respected Loire Valley Chenin Blanc producers. And our Chenin Blanc is kind of patterned after his style. Jean has been here several times. We've been there several times. His son actually worked here one harvest, as I recall, Florent. And that's why we just like Chenin Blanc.
And actually, I see a few people here. I think Deb and Eugenia and Lee, and I don't know who else is on this call, but they actually met Florent Baumard, Dad, a couple of years ago when we went to the Loire Valley with them. Do you remember that, everybody? Anyway, well, gosh, this was fun. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And for asking all the great questions and
the next tasting we have is going to be on April 21st. It's already on our website. If you haven't signed up already, we have our associate winemaker, Brian Pruitt. He is going to be walking through a vertical of the Mariner. So 2017, 18, and 19. You guys always ask how these wines age. So it's a phenomenal time to be able to taste 3 of them right in a row. Ask all your questions of Brian. He's a great resource if you haven't met him already. Just a wonderful person. So we're excited to give him his own virtual tasting here and watch him fly. So hopefully we will see you next month on virtual if we don't see you sooner than that. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions whatsoever. Let us know what other virtual tastings you want to see. We love seeing your faces. Thank you so much for joining us again on this.
Someone put on the screen that they're going to be at the winery next Saturday.
Oh,
yep.
Who's going to be?
That's right, George. George is going to be at the winery next Saturday. I know, Kim, you probably aren't going to be.
I would not mind coming up meeting George myself personally, as long as they know, give me a half-hour notice and I'll be here.
All right, George, you got your dad and George, you got a date. I'll be actually, which one's George? Let's see. Can we see who? Oh, I see George.
Where do you come from, George?
I'm trying to unmute you, George.
You're still muted.
Okay, yeah, we're in Clovis, close to Fresno, California.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to be there with about 4 of our neighbors.
Well, when you get to the winery, let them have them call me at home. I'm only about 20 minutes away. I become.
Well, that's great. We'll
We'll all be there.
That would be fun.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
George.
Somebody I saw is coming to Passport to Dry Creek Valley, and we will be here. I don't know if Dad, maybe you'll pop by and say hi on Passport weekend. Are you? It looks like you're writing it down.
Writing George's name down. Okay.
Oh, I love it. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you again soon in person or virtually. We miss you guys. We love you guys. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you, Dave and Kim, for doing this,
Bye-bye.
sharing this fun story.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone have a great night.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.